I'm Stuart Varney.
I'm Martha McCallum.
I'm Jason Chaffetz, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, August 20th, 2021. I'm Jessica Rosenthal. As the work continues to get desperate U.S. citizens and Afghans out of Afghanistan, others are looking ahead for those who will remain there. What will life be like under the Taliban now?
I don't have a lot of faith right now that anything will be different between the Taliban of 2021 and the Taliban of 2001.
I'm Lisa Brady. How much political fallout could the president face over the fall of Afghanistan?
Does this mean it's the end of the Biden presidency? No. And every president goes through some bad times, but these are really bad times. And Afghanistan is a real failure for this administration.
We speak with Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace.
And I'm Geraldo Rivera. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
The State Department and Pentagon say the U.S. military is working to evacuate U.S. citizens and legal residents who were in Afghanistan as the Taliban took over. But there are reports indicating that it's difficult to get to the airport in Kabul, that the Taliban members are stopping people from getting in. Pentagon spokesman John Kirby.
We are in communication, obviously, with the local Taliban commander about making sure that those at-risk Afghans, special immigrant visa applicants, and additional Afghan citizens that we want to move through are able to move through. And it comes down a lot to the credentialing and making sure that they can prove and we can prove that these are appropriate people to move through.
And while officials say they are also working to get vulnerable Afghans out, many others desperately want to leave. Others who maybe did not work with the U.S., but people like Professor Najibullah Yousefi in Kabul, who believes he's a Taliban target.
All the people feel alone. And feel fear, and especially women and girls.
Yousefi teaches girls at the Mawad Academy, which was bombed 3 years ago. I asked him how he feels as America leaves after 20 years.
We are shocked. We are surprised and we are shocked because our government, unfortunately, our government doesn't have enough motivation to fight with Taliban soldiers.
He said he believes there will be a civil war and that while his government may not have the motivation to fight the Taliban, the people do. He said they just need leadership.
If it's possible, the U.S. Army come back and save the people.
Yousefi says the U.S. will have a moral problem on our hands if we watch the Taliban slaughter Afghan civilians and fail to return to stop them, saying there isn't much hope among the people right now.
So I was in Mazar Sharif when it fell.
Hollie McKay is a freelance war correspondent and the author of Only Cry for the Living.
And I'd been there a few days with my photographer, and we were just doing interviews and kind of trying to capture the front lines. And everyone that I'd spoken to really assured me that Mazar was not going to fall. It was a very staunch anti-Taliban stronghold and had been that way for 20 years. And everyone just was very confident that there was no way, and if it was going to fall, that wouldn't happen for several weeks. So I didn't really feel when I was there initially that there was anything to be concerned about. People were in the street, the markets were full, and we just had an amazing time. The energy and the vitality was just incredible. And then as the hours started to go by, you really felt this sense of people were suddenly disappearing from the streets and the stores were closing early, and that second darkness hit, there wouldn't be a soul. And so I started to feel a little unnerved. And then on the day that it happened, it was just a bizarre ghost town. And I remember I was sick and I wasn't really feeling well. And we went out and we wanted to go closer to the front line. And we got in a cab and we drove a little bit along an abandoned road heading out of the city. And then the cab driver just looked at us and he said, "We need to stop. I'm scared. We need to turn around." And my photographer and I sort of looked at each other because we were both sort of under the impression that things were really in control. And we went out early that evening to get some kebabs, and there was just nobody in the street and there was no noise. And that was the eerie part. It wasn't that there was a lot of noise, it was the real lack of noise in the city. And we just looked at each other and said, "Do you feel something's wrong?" And we agreed, and we sort of hurried back to our guest house. And as we hurried back, motorcycles came in, and that was the Taliban.
We talked to a teacher in Kabul, and he said the Taliban members are saying all the right things, like that girls can still go to school and the media can keep operating, etc. But he said, don't believe them, watch their actions, not their words. Are you seeing or hearing about their actions? I mean, we've heard reports that Taliban members are beating people, taking their documents as they try and get to the airport.
I don't have a lot of faith right now that anything will be different between the Taliban of 2021 and the Taliban of 2001. And again, that really will require them to show up instead of speaking it. But there is a very interesting PR spin going on, especially from the top leadership. But on the ground, the leadership can only control so much. And so you do have a lot of very rogue elements, especially in a lot of provinces. And my fear is that once the U.S. withdrawal is complete and the foreigners all leave, it really will be the Afghans that are left to that kind of slaughter. And they know that, and they're terrified.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what are the Afghan people telling you about their fears of the future? Do they have any hope, or is it mostly just fear?
They're terrified. I'm yet to really meet anybody that's not in the Taliban that supports the Taliban. People are terrified. People have enjoyed a certain sense of freedom over the past 20 years, especially in urban areas like Kabul, where women can have a lot more choice in how they choose to leave the house, in being able to go places on their own, to be educated. To think that they would have to give all that up, whether they're a journalist or an artist, they're just desperate to escape. They're trying to write letters to appeal to the U.S. government, and even resorting to being smuggled into other countries just because they know the fate that awaits them, and they're just so desperate to get out. And it's really heartbreaking because I feel very gutted that I can't do more for them other than help support them with a letter or refer them to an organization that's really set up to do that.
Earlier this week, President Biden defended his handling of the withdrawal, insisting he had to either continue to withdraw fully, as the Trump administration had committed to, or send more troops in, which would risk renewed Taliban attacks. President Biden said we would stay beyond August 31st if we need to in order to evacuate everyone, including Afghans and their families. Hugo Lorenz was the U.S. ambassador in Kabul in 2016 and 17, and previously held an ambassador-ranked position in 2012 in Afghanistan as well.
If you were going to ask me that it was all going to end on this past Sunday, on August the 15th, no. But I wouldn't have given it too much more time. I mean, my sense is that the decision to so rapidly and precipitously remove U.S. and by extension NATO forces from Afghanistan in such a quick manner would leave the Afghan security forces really up in the air. And the end result would be both a collapse in the morale of the force as well as their military capability. So I expected that by sort of the latter part of this year, if you're looking at October and November, in my mind, I think it would be very clear that the situation for our friends in Afghanistan, our allies in the government in Kabul, would be in a very bad way. No surprises, but obviously it happened much quicker than I expected.
So I guess the question then is, should we have stayed? Should we have stayed indefinitely? Remember,
we were not fighting the war like 10 years ago. We didn't have 100,000 men. We weren't spending $130 billion on the war. We were having casualties that were a fraction of U.S. training accidents every year in the U.S. Army. From 2015 to 2020, we never lost more than 22 men killed in action. Again, every life is precious, but it's important to have perspective. And in the treasure perspective, I'm saying we were spending 2.5% of defense spending. So we were in a position to sustain it. We were a residual force. But what we brought to the table were advisors that were embedded in Afghan units that will help them be very effective. Okay, they made sure that the soldiers were getting paid, they were getting food, that they were getting munitions. And the Afghans are tough fighters. If they get food and they get their pay, they're going to fight. Obviously, that system started breaking down once we removed all of our forces. And we had some special forces that were used effectively but at the margin. And then finally, the most important thing, Jessica, was the air piece. We had a very small air force in Afghanistan, maybe 90, 100 aircraft, but we had a basing network all over the country, and we have a very effective air force. If the Taliban concentrated 100 guys, in 15 minutes, you're going to have an aircraft with precision ordnance dropping stuff on them.
So wait, but
Yes.
are you saying that we should have stayed with the small force that we had, that was working?
Correct. If you would have told me, I'm an American citizen and I'm a taxpayer. If you told me, should we keep 100,000 troops in Afghanistan, 50,000 troops in Afghanistan? Should we spend $100 billion? Is it worth it? I would agree with Presidents Trump and Biden. But that was not the situation. The situation is we had a small residual force of some advisors, small number of special forces, and a very small, maybe 1.5%, 2% of the U.S. Air Force was deployed in Afghanistan. We could have kept it until such time till both sides realized that there was no military victory to be had, and they would come to the table and negotiate an Afghan agreement, which would have been a political settlement, probably some type of power sharing. I mean, I'm not going to negotiate for the Afghans, but I think that would have been the result. And based on that, the U.S. and its allies could have withdrawn.
Ambassador, tell me your thoughts on the future here. I spoke to a teacher in Kabul this week. He is terrified. He taught women and girls. He thinks he's a target, and he wants to get out. I think he's probably pretty low on the totem pole since we can't even seem to get our own folks out. But he's afraid of the future with the Taliban in charge. And he said, they're saying all the right things, right? Like girls can still go to school and we're going to have an inclusive government, et cetera. But he said, he doesn't believe them. And I'm just wondering, based on your experience there and based on the fears of the people who are not in support of the Taliban, what does the future hold for this country?
I would be very worried. I mean, I have a lot of Afghan friends, and I'm hearing pretty credible reports that they're, barging into people's houses, taking their property. Wow. They are looking for senior military officers, senior intelligence officers. There are lots of reports, particularly outside of Kabul, of executions, of bad treatment of women. Schools are closed outside of Kabul. So again, I think you have to be very, very worried. But your question's a good one, Jessica. I mean, the U.S. and the international community has to send a very clear message to the Taliban that they won't get a penny of U.S. And international economic assistance unless they respect the rights of their people, and particularly women. And it starts also with cooperating with the U.S. in being able to get all American citizens out of Afghanistan, which is something, as you know, we're working on right now, and also to get the thousands of Afghans who worked in our embassy, who worked with our military and risked their lives in this fight. And we owe it to them to bring them back and not leave anyone behind. So I think that would be our first priority. Let's get our people home. And the next one is that the world will not recognize the Taliban unless they respect the rights of their own people.
Ambassador Lorenz, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jessica.
This is Geraldo Rivera with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Not much brings Congress together these days, but what's happening in Afghanistan has crossed the aisle.
We deserve answers. We intend to get answers.
Pennsylvania Congresswoman Sue Wild is one of the Democrats supporting calls for congressional hearings. She says it was past time to withdraw, but not like this.
The manner in which this was executed was clearly not a success story, and to say anything other than that is a disservice to the servicemen and women.
The White House already is juggling a number of other challenges, including the ongoing fight with COVID. Could Afghanistan derail the president's entire agenda?
I doubt it, but, defeat plays on itself, and a perception of failure and weakness plays on itself.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday.
There's no question that Joe Biden and his administration and his agenda is weaker today than it was a week ago today. Now, having said that, do I think that House Democrats are going to vote against the infrastructure bill because the president mishandled Afghanistan? Probably not. But he's in a weaker position, no question about it.
I mean, there have been some supportive statements from fellow Democrats. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi comes to mind. There hasn't really been a rush to the president's defense on this, though. Is that a sign that they're worried about the wider and longer term potential political implications of this?
No, I don't think it's that so much. Listen, I think that if you were to take a poll of all the statements, verbal and written, from Democratic members of Congress, the vast majority have been critical. And I think the reason is because there's really no other response. Yes, I did see that Nancy Pelosi was talking about how strong the president was. I don't think anybody other than diehard Democrats are going to buy that. Look, you've got in the Senate, but most of these committees, well, all the committees are run by Democrats. They have the majority. You have a tie vote plus the vice president. And you've had people like Intelligence Committee Chair Mark Warner, Democrat of Virginia, and Bob Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, who's the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And they're all saying, we're going to have hearings on this. Look, this was a failure. It was a screw-up. The policy was very questionable, and the execution was unquestionably bad. And there's just no way you can get around it. And you can be a loyal Democrat, but you can't put lipstick on this pig.
What about the potential for kind of a compounding effect? I mean, Republicans certainly are saying, look, this is just another example of the crises that this administration creates, which I'm sure the White House would dispute that, perspective. But in the latest Fox News poll that was taken earlier this month, some other issues, had been rising sort of to the top of things that people said they were concerned about, either extremely or very concerned about. The coronavirus and healthcare are still up there, but also things like violent crime.
And inflation and immigration. No, look, the president had a really good ride for about 4 or 5 months. And I know some of the listeners are going to say it's because he had an easy press. Things seem to be going pretty well, and particularly COVID seemed to be going very well. But with the rise of the Delta variant and the huge spike, and we're now seeing over 100,000 new cases a day, and the continuing crisis at the border, and that's what you have to call it, when you've got 100,000 people coming across the border every month, and inflation going up, and now a complete failure after a 20-year war in, I think, according to the polls, most people supported the idea of getting out of Afghanistan. I don't think that was a politically unpopular position. And Lord knows it's what Donald Trump set in motion with the peace deal he made with the Taliban back in 2020. It's the execution of it and the fact that we seem to have been so flat-footed, and we still have 15,000 Americans there and 65,000 Afghans who helped us, and that we have promised to get out of the country, still stuck there. So, does this mean it's the end of the Biden presidency? No, and every president goes through some bad times, but these are really bad times, and Afghanistan is a real failure for this administration. It's really been a mess on every level: policy, intelligence, PR, optics, politics. It's been a mess.
The Delta surge of COVID doesn't seem to be nearly over yet. Is there something more the administration should be doing on that besides things like, requiring nursing home staffers to get vaccines?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's obviously, this has become hugely politicized, the fact that you now have, and I say this in quotes, civil wars going on in some of these states between the governors in Florida and Texas, for instance, who have bans on masks in schools, mask mandates in schools, and school districts. And in Florida, you just had Miami-Dade, the largest school district in the state, and I think one of the top 3 or 4 in the country, basically just ignore the governor rather and say, no, we're going to impose a mask mandate. And to a certain degree, the president certainly has talked enough, as much as he could, about vaccines and masks. And, when you have 100 million Americans, or just about, who refuse or are eligible for vaccines and refusing to get it, I'm not sure what more the president can do.
I'm wondering, too, whether the new booster shot plan might actually end up being a deterrent for people who are already hesitant to get the first shot if they now know that they may end up needing 3 shots.
Well, if they view it as a deterrent, they're foolish. I mean, first of all, my own view is I got the shot the minute that I was able to get it. As an older person, I was able to get it, in February. But, I remember I was at my home and about an hour away from the hospital that called up and said, you're eligible for a shot today. Would you like it? And I got in the car and I went. And let me tell you, the day that I'm eligible for a booster shot, I'm going to go get it. So, it's sort of like saying if you're going to be wildly reckless and careless, and 97 or 8% of the people who are in hospitals are unvaccinated, yes, you can get a Delta even with the vaccination, but you're very much less likely to end up in the hospital or dead. If that's not enough, and if they're now saying to you, well, there's some waning effectiveness from this and you need to get a booster, and if you do, your antibodies will be boosted by 10 times. Again, I just listen to science, I listen to facts, and I don't understand why people aren't getting it, and I certainly don't understand why a booster would make you less likely to get it.
There's some pushback from the World Health Organization. One official likens it to giving an extra life jacket to someone who's already got one while other people are drowning. Are we losing sight of the worldwide picture of this pandemic?
Yes, there's no question about it. I mean, as a factual matter, you could argue that if you've got millions more. Now, the U.S. and President Biden have done more than any other country in the world. We're committed, I think, to giving 600 doses out to other countries in the world. But when you consider the population of the world, 600 million doses is not much. More than any other country is given, but it's not much. And you certainly could make the argument that dose that, is going to be given out as a booster could go better to somebody who's completely unprotected. It's an interesting thing. I think there's a line here in terms of America first, and I know that's the Trump line, but I think it's pretty hard for an American president or American official to say, yes, there are other people who need it more, but if there's an American citizen and your protection is going to wane, that we should give that to somebody else and endanger you. I mean, in the end, I can understand where an American leader would say, we're going to take care of our fellow Americans first before we take care of other people. And, in an interesting way, I think there's a comparison to Afghanistan here. I remember when it was announced that Biden was going to pull all troops out, I talked to a top White House official, a woman, and I said, well, what about the Afghan women who are going to suffer if the Taliban takes over? This is back in April. And she said, look, that may well happen, but in the end, that's not in America's national security interest. We care terribly about those women, but we can't send American men and women to fight and potentially to die to protect Afghan men and women.
Yeah, I guess it always comes back, at least partly, to how could it end up affecting us if we do something or don't do it. And like with the booster shots, I guess WHO's argument is, well, look, if too many people remain unvaccinated in other parts of the world, it allows more transmission and allows the potential for more variants to develop.
Yeah, all of that is absolutely true. On the other hand, the flip side of that argument is, we're not going to solve the world's problem with vaccines. Even if we took 100 million or 200 million or 300 million doses, we're talking about billions of doses to solve the world's population. So it's got to be a worldwide response. And, in the end, we have to look to ourselves to protecting ourselves first. It's a legitimate and very difficult and painful policy argument, but clearly that's the decision the president has made.
One other quick question, just about the mood of the United States, because we saw that consumer confidence plunge in the latest reading. Do you get a sense people are just discouraged, especially watching the COVID numbers rise so dramatically again?
Absolutely. Look, as I said earlier, there are a number of problems and growing problems on Joe Biden's plate right now, and Afghanistan is one, but rising COVID numbers, inflation, the continuing crisis at the border with tens of thousands of people coming across. There are a lot of reasons that Americans aren't feeling as good about the state of the country, whether we're on the right track and whether this president is the guy to keep us in the right track. It happens to every president. Some are able to get out of it, some aren't. And this is Joe Biden's turn in the barrel. We'll see how he does.
Who do you have on the show this weekend?
Well, we're going to have a top White House official about Afghanistan. We're also going to be talking to Republican Senator Ben Sasse, who's a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee. We want to find out what exactly was the intelligence about a quick Taliban takeover, and what do we do now? I mean, yes, part of it is looking back, but I think the most important thing now, and I really want to focus on this with the White House official, is what do we do now? What do we do now in terms of getting those 15,000 Americans to the airport, the 65,000 Afghans who risked their lives to protect us, and what do we do in terms of dealing with the Taliban going forward, and most importantly, what do we do in terms of protecting the U.S. homeland from terror groups that may regenerate inside Afghanistan?
Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday, thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure, Lisa. It's good talking to you.
I'm Guy Benson. Join me weekdays at 3 p.m. Eastern as we break down the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest newsmakers and guests. Listen live on the Fox News app or get the free podcast at GuyBensonShow.com.
Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tonya J. Powers.
Locals in Belfast Harbor, Maine are working to unravel a whodunit. But this isn't a murder mystery. They're trying to figure out how a 25-foot-tall inflatable yellow duck got into the harbor over the weekend and just who put it there. As if the sight of a bright yellow overgrown tub toy wouldn't be enough to bring a smile to one's face, the duck is emblazoned with the word joy for good measure. The Bangor Daily News reports that Harbor Master Catherine Given says that the floating waterfowl doesn't pose a navigational hazard, so they're not in a hurry to shoo it away. It's anchored in a shallow part of the harbor. The duck has even been making an appearance on social media, with people posting photos of it. Given says everyone loves it, and a lot of people seem to want to keep joy around. Tonya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Geraldo Rivera.
What's on your mind?
Hi, everybody. This is Geraldo Rivera reporting. And like millions of you, I have Afghanistan on my mind. After 20 years, we are cutting and running from the chaotic South Asian country that we invaded 2 decades ago. After they provided safe haven to al-Qaeda, the international terrorists who murdered 3,000 of our friends and neighbors on September 11th, 2001. President Trump wanted out. Obviously, so did Joe Biden. After 2,500 dead GIs and $1 trillion spent, Trump says he would have left in a much more muscular posture. He says he would have bombed the hell out of the Taliban and the equipment that we left behind if they did anything to threaten Americans or our allies on the way out. Maybe a Trump withdrawal would have had more dignity and strength. We'll never know. We do know that under President Biden, our retreat has been a mess. Despite Taliban assurances that they would facilitate the evacuation, there have been widespread incidents of Taliban forces interfering with our people, reportedly making their way to the Kabul airport. The result is an evacuation that is sputtering and inefficient. We have the planes, but some are leaving that dreadful airport half empty, because not enough passengers have made their way through the Taliban checkpoints ringing the airport. As we learned in the decades following Vietnam, defeat is a bitter pill to swallow. Vietnam fell to the communists way back in 1975, 46 years ago, but the wound still festers. The Taliban claims they are different than they once were. They say women and girls, for example, will not be repressed under their new government. They say human rights groups will be able to function freely. Having spent many months over 11 assignments there over as many years, I have deep doubts about that. I am also hurt by the gross dysfunction of our withdrawal. As I said, defeat is always hard to swallow. But my God, we could have gotten out with dignity that honored the memory of the tens of thousands who served there so honorably in that rotten place. I'm Geraldo Rivera reporting. Fox News.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Hey, it's Brett Larson, inviting you to download and listen to the new daily Fox on Tech podcast. There's part of a colorful late 90s iMac on Mars. It's an idea that seems a lot like Kickstarter called Build It. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.